I watched my own nephew's eyes and didn't see a relative. I saw a vulture already planning how to rip apart my inheritance. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was how he made my own daughter question whether I was losing my mind. That was the moment I realized this fight wouldn't be about property. It would be about reputation. And I decided to use a weapon against him that I had hidden inside a family heirloom 50 years ago. My name is George. I'm 70 years old, and for most of my life, I was a software engineer. But my true passion was bringing dead, intricate mechanisms back to life. My pride and joy isn't money. It's an extraordinary 19th century grandfather clock. It's not just an antique. It's a magnificent, towering piece that houses a small, well-hidden safe. Inside, it doesn't hold gold bars or bonds. It holds the soul of my family, my grandfather's handwritten love letters to my grandmother, letters penned on cheap paper during the war. These pieces of history, these feelings, are truly priceless to me. After my wife, Martha, passed away last year, the silence in the house was deafening. And that's when the vultures, drawn by the scent of perceived weakness and potential assets, started circling. Before moving on, if you're into tales of subtle, long-game revenge and real-life drama where the cleverest person wins, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss the rest of this truly unbelievable story as it unfolds. The primary vulture was my nephew, Kevin. He's a realtor, smooth, perpetually smiling, and smelling money wherever he goes. He used to visit every few months, but after Martha's funeral, he was suddenly at my house almost every week, always just checking in on me. But his true focus was always the clock. He didn't see the history. He saw the potential auction price, probably enough for a down payment on a flashy new car. He immediately started viewing me as just an old, fragile man, easy prey, someone who would sign anything if he applied enough pressure. He saw my grief and assumed it came with senility. His tactics were insidious and utterly exhausting. He didn't outright demand the clock at first. He'd start conversations with lines like, "Uncle George, that thing is worth a fortune, easily 6 figures. It's a huge liability, just gathering dust. I know an easy buyer who could give you cash immediately." When I firmly reiterated that it was never for sale, that it was a piece of us, he changed his tack. He began subtly questioning my lucidity, always cloaked in fake concern. He'd mention how forgetful I was, or how I needed to downsize, and that the clock was too heavy a burden for a man in my condition. The real dramatic tension wasn't about the clock itself. It was about the insidious way he tried to steal my dignity and my memory, attempting to drive a wedge between me and my own daughter by suggesting I was incapable of managing my affairs. He planted seeds of doubt everywhere. But I wasn't just old. I was an architect of mechanisms. And my masterwork, my silent promise to myself, had been installed half a century ago, waiting for this exact moment of greed to strike. And on that day I received the text message that validated a 50-year plan. Safe. Access attempt. Living room. Kevin had just walked right into my perfect trap. Thread's worst thing about Kevin's relentless pressure wasn't the threat to the clock itself. It was the damage he inflicted on my relationship with my daughter, Sarah. Sarah is my world. She visits daily, making sure I eat and take my medicine. And since Martha passed, she's been my anchor. Kevin knew exactly where to strike. He would never confront me directly about my sanity. He would call Sarah, always with a tone of deep, manufactured concern, saying things like, "Sarah, Uncle George keeps mentioning this deal we supposedly had about the clock. He seems genuinely confused when I bring it up. Are you sure he's completely lucid? I'm worried he might sign something away by mistake, or that someone else could take advantage of him. Sarah started to look at me differently. It was a subtle shift, a tiny, almost imperceptible frown when I misplaced my glasses. A slightly condescending, overly patient tone when she reminded me of an upcoming doctor's appointment. She never accused me outright, but the doubt was there, hanging in the air between us like a cloud of invisible gas. She was battling between her love for her father and the terrifying possibility that her cousin was right, and that I was truly slipping away. One evening, the silence broke. She gently brought it up as we were finishing dinner. "Dad, Kevin said you promised him the clock if you ever sold the house. Did you forget you had that conversation with him?" That question, that soft, fearful question, stabbed me deeper than any of Kevin's greed. To have my memory, my sanity, questioned by the person I loved most, all because of a lying, greedy weasel. I defended myself, of course, denying the deal firmly, explaining that Kevin was a liar driven by money. But I could see the struggle in her eyes. Kevin was family too, and she wanted to believe him. Words were clearly useless against Kevin's smooth, practiced lies. I was losing the battle for my own daughter's trust, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. I realized then that trying to reason with a shark only makes you look weaker. I needed proof, not just for Sarah, but for myself. I needed an undeniable, visible moment of truth that would shatter Kevin's facade forever. And that's when my mind, the old engineer's mind that had built complex systems for decades, went back 50 years. I remembered the solution I had built into the clock when I was just a young man, starting out in mechanics. It was my secret weapon, designed for a hypothetical thief, now aimed squarely at my own blood. The anti-theft system wasn't some high-tech GPS tracker, which wouldn't exist for decades. It was purely mechanical and chemical, designed to be dormant and invisible. I spent the next few days in my workshop, meticulously pulling out the schematics I'd drawn up back in the 1970s. Blueprints for a perfectly hidden, pressure-sensitive trigger. I needed to know if the latent mechanism, the minuscule hidden pin, and the delicate pressure plate was still functioning after all this time. When I finally found the access point and gently, meticulously tested the main gear train, I heard a faint, satisfying click, the sound of an old promise being kept. The trap was ready to be quietly armed. Kevin had just escalated this from a family argument into a war of wits, and he didn't even know his opponent had been training for 50 years. To truly understand the depth of this revenge, deep of this revenge, you have to go back in time, all the way to 1975. I was 20 years old, fresh out of university, bursting with engineering ideas, and restoring Grandpa's magnificent clock was my first major project. The sheer artistry of the piece was incredible, but I noticed immediately that the locking mechanism for the internal safe, the part holding those precious war letters, was laughably simple for a safe of its supposed caliber. I knew it held priceless family history, and I knew, even then, that future greed would inevitably target it. So, I didn't just fix the lock, I essentially redesigned the security from the inside out. My idea was to create an intellectual riddle, a secondary security layer that was completely invisible from the outside. I spent weeks carving out a tiny, meticulously measured channel in the non-moving timber near the pendulum's anchor point. I installed a minuscule, pressure-sensitive pin, connecting it with an almost hair-thin, custom-made wire that ran up the inside of the clock casing. This wire led directly to a tiny, spring-loaded internal chamber. The entire system was entirely mechanical, self-contained, and completely hidden from view unless you knew exactly where and how to look. The logic was pure engineer's malice. If you opened the exterior decorative lock, the easy part, and then attempted to access the safe contents without pressing this hidden pin first, the secondary system would instantly and irrevocably arm itself. The true beauty of it was that the entire disarming process was integrated into the clock's own rhythm. You needed to press the hidden pin at the exact split-second moment the pendulum reached its furthest point in the swing. Miss the beat, and the primary, hidden trap would silently enter its active state. It wasn't designed to hurt anyone, not physically. I didn't want to damage the clock or cause injury. I designed it solely to instantly mark and expose the attempted theft. It was my secret challenge to the future, a way to protect the heirloom from anyone, even family, who valued money over our history. I put the clock back together, sealed the secret access panel, and for 5 decades the trap lay dormant. I almost forgot it existed, only checking the mechanism during my yearly maintenance. Until Kevin started his vicious campaign of lies. Now, the stakes were suddenly higher than just protecting old letters. It was about protecting my reputation, my dignity, and my relationship with Sarah. I pulled out those old, faded blueprints, confirming the exact location of the hidden pin and the intricate wiring. It was time to switch the system from dormant protection to active defense. I had to prepare the spring-loaded chamber with the marking agent that would bring the truth to light. The final, crucial preparation was about to begin. Activating a 50-year-old security mechanism required the utmost precision, but it was a challenge that brought my old engineering mind back to life. I spent a long, late night in the living room, ostensibly polishing the clock and resetting the chimes, but really working the secret access point near the pendulum anchor. My first task was preparing the payload. I took the small, spring-loaded chamber I had built decades ago and meticulously filled it with a special marking agent. This wasn't toxic paint or anything dangerous. It was a non-harmful, easily washable, and perfectly clear dye, the kind used by bank security systems, but the key feature was that it was only visible under ultraviolet light. When it sprayed, the thief wouldn't even notice the telltale evidence silently gathering on his hands. Next came the crucial element of modern surveillance: the notification. The old clock had heavy, solid brass weights. I carefully drilled a tiny, non-structural cavity into one of the fixed, non-moving weights and installed a minuscule GSM module, smaller than a matchbox. This little piece of tech was connected to the same tripwire as the die chamber. If the trap was sprung, the mechanism wouldn't just release the die. It would send a silent, pre-programmed text message simultaneously to my phone, and crucially, to Sarah's phone as well. The message was simple, stark, and terrifying. Safe. Access attempt. Living room. This gave me real-time, undeniable confirmation without needing loud, traditional house alarms that Kevin could simply disable. It was my engineering past, shaking hands with my software present. I also had to finalize the auditory element, the shock factor. I connected a tiny canister of compressed air to a miniature, high-pitched whistle, like the kind used on a starting pistol, hiding it deep inside the clock's casing. It was designed to go off simultaneously with the die. It wouldn't cause any physical harm whatsoever, just a sudden, terrifyingly loud noise meant to shock the thief, make him panic, and ensure he immediately fled the scene before he could cause any real damage or try to tamper with the evidence. The whole event would be over in 2 seconds, leaving only 2 things behind: the loud noise and the invisible proof. With the trap armed and tested, all I needed was the perfect piece of bait. Kevin had been incessantly hounding Sarah about the perfect time to visit me, when she could help me with paperwork and he could size up the clock without me hovering. So I fabricated the ideal opportunity. I told Sarah we had a mandatory 4-hour follow-up appointment with my doctor across town, starting early the next morning. Then I sealed the deal. I deliberately left the decorative clock key sitting conspicuously on the mantelpiece, right beside the clock, practically inviting him to take the first, easy step. Looking at the majestic clock that night, I felt a strange mix of terror and electric anticipation. The 50-year wait was finally over. Tomorrow, Kevin would choose between his greed and his family, and my brilliant, silent judge would deliver its verdict. The next morning felt incredibly heavy, charged with a quiet, electric tension. I played the part perfectly. The slightly frail old man needing a steadying hand to the car, meticulously confirming the long travel time to the doctor's office across town. Sarah was genuinely worried about the mandatory 4-hour appointment, which added a layer of cruel authenticity to my performance. As we drove away from the driveway, I didn't look back at the house, but I knew Kevin was watching from somewhere. His entire plan hinged on the assumption that 4 hours across town was plenty of time for him to execute his theft and be gone without a trace. We reached the main highway, and I tried to distract Sarah with small talk about the weather, but my entire focus was on my phone, which was sitting silently in the cup holder. I pictured the scene I knew was unfolding back home. I imagined Kevin, likely letting himself in with the spare key he'd somehow managed to duplicate or coerce Sarah into giving him previously. I could practically see the slick, self-satisfied look on his face as he walked across my living room rug, probably not bothering to be quiet, treating my home as his personal, unguarded vault. The sheer violation of that image, a family member breaking the sacred trust of my home just for profit, made my blood run cold. It wasn't just about protecting the clock anymore. It was about the fundamental disrespect for everything I had built and held dear. We were about 30 minutes into the drive, deep into a conversation about Sarah's garden, when my phone vibrated. Just once, a soft, deliberate pulse. I tried to stay calm, to keep the conversation flowing naturally, but the adrenaline was surging. I snatched the phone up, trying to hide the screen from Sarah's peripheral vision, and there it was, stark and cold. Safe. Access attempt. Living room. At the exact same second, Sarah's phone, which was connected to her car's audio, played the gentle ping of a new message. She glanced down at her console. "Oh, my phone just went off. Wonder what that is. Probably a work email." My heart hammered in my chest. The trap was sprung. He was in, and his greedy hands were on the clock. "Probably just work, honey," I said, my voice miraculously steadier than I felt, managing a small, shaky laugh. I took a deep breath, letting the engineer in me celebrate the successful activation of the GSM module. Then, I put on the final part of my act. "You know, Sarah," I continued, putting on a show of sudden, panicked confusion, "I think I left the entire folder of insurance documents we need for the appointment back on the kitchen counter. I am so terribly sorry. I'm going to have to turn around." Sarah groaned softly at the delay, but agreed instantly. As I smoothly executed the U-turn on the empty road, I felt a grim, powerful sense of control. The hunter was now heading back to the trap, and the prey was still inside, unknowingly basking in his short-lived victory. While I were racing back home, Kevin was having his critical moment of imagined triumph in my quiet living room. He'd found the key on the mantelpiece, exactly where I'd left it, and used it to easily unlock the decorative outer door of the majestic grandfather clock. Inside, the small internal safe mechanism was now exposed. He likely sneered, convinced that the old man had forgotten to secure the real treasure, viewing the whole arrangement as amateur hour. He pulled out his slim tools, confident and slick, bypassing the easy tumblers quickly. But he didn't know about the 5 decades of quiet thought I'd put into protecting that history. He was so focused on the visible lock mechanism that he completely missed the subtlety of the pendulum's slow, rhythmic swing. As he reached deep inside the casing to manually trigger what he thought was the final, easy latch, he accidentally pressed hard on the small section of wood that housed my hidden, pressure-sensitive pin. He did it outside of the prescribed beat, and with that single, accidental movement, the invisible sequence was completed. The trap was sprung, but not in the way he expected. The result was instantaneous and chaotic. First, the room was pierced by a deafening, high-pitched screech, the whistle I had installed, powered by that tiny canister of compressed air. The sound was so sudden and sharp, it was designed to make the heart stop and panic an immediate priority. Simultaneously, deep inside the clock, the miniature UV light I had built into the inner dial flashed brightly, and the spring-loaded die chamber popped. It released a fine, transparent mist of the non-toxic marking agent directly onto his reaching hands, the lower portion of his wrists, and the exposed cuffs of his crisp shirt. It lasted less than a second, but the die was precisely and effectively targeted. Kevin was instantly thrown backward, clutching his ears against the shocking, painful noise. He looked wildly around the living room, panicked that a neighbor might have heard the blast, which sounded exactly like a starter pistol had gone off in the house. He checked his hands frantically. Nothing, just a slight clear wetness from the fine mist, which he immediately assumed was just oil or dust from the old mechanism. He quickly wiped his hands on his expensive trousers, stuffing the tools back into his briefcase. He had failed to open the safe, but worse, he was terrified of being caught by me or Sarah returning early. He quickly slammed the clock door shut, grabbed his bag, and sprinted out of the house. He didn't know that the undeniable evidence of his crime was now invisibly, chemically fused to his skin, waiting for the perfect light to expose him for the greedy thief he was. Drive back was a blur of controlled urgency. I kept glancing at Sarah, who was completely unaware of the drama that had just occurred. She was only annoyed that we were wasting time and would miss half the day. I made sure to act apologetic, playing up the forgetful old man role that Kevin had so conveniently created for me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, but inside I was a coiled spring of calculated calm. I knew Kevin was gone, but the evidence was waiting for us. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Kevin's car was gone, just as I expected. I parked, and, moving slowly for Sarah's benefit, we entered the house. The living room looked normal. Everything was in place. The grandfather clock stood majestic and silent against the wall, its pendulum swinging in its steady rhythm, almost mocking the panic that had just been unleashed inside its casing. Then we saw Kevin. He was standing near the fireplace, attempting to look casual, holding a glass of water. He had clearly returned after his panicked exit and was trying to look innocent, perhaps waiting to see if we had heard the whistle or if the clock showed any visible damage. He flashed a nervous, overly bright smile. "Oh, hey guys, I was just dropping by some paperwork for Sarah," he chirped, gesturing vaguely toward a briefcase. "Heard you guys had an appointment, so I didn't want to disturb you." He was smooth, but I'm an old engineer. I pay attention to minute details. I immediately noticed 3 things. First, he was standing too far from the clock. Second, his smile was strained, and sweat beaded faintly on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the room. Third, he was keeping his hands in his pockets, almost surgically glued there. Sarah, however, noticed something else when he momentarily pulled one hand out to nervously smooth his hair. "Kevin, what's that on your hands? Did you get oil on yourself?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Kevin's face instantly went pale. "Oh, that? No. Uncle George asked me to quickly check the hinges on his old garden shed. Dirty work, you know. I haven't had a chance to wash up yet." He immediately shoved the hand back into his pocket. His lie was clumsy, exposed by his own panic and Sarah's simple, genuine question. He was covering a tiny, clear, oily residue that he couldn't get rid of, convinced it was just shed dirt. He had no idea he was already chemically marked. I looked at him, feeling no anger, only a profound, cold sense of satisfaction. "Kevin, my garden shed hasn't been used in 2 years. Its hinges are rust, not oil," I said softly, my voice calm but carrying the weight of the accusation. "But since you're here, why don't you stay? I have a very important, urgent family announcement that I need to share with everyone, immediately." I pulled out my phone. The time for private warnings was over. The time for public humiliation was about to begin. My calm demeanor after catching Kevin in his clumsy lie rattled him even more than the whistle probably did. He was clearly trying to figure out if I was truly delusional or if I knew something. My offer for him to stay for a very important, urgent family announcement put him on edge. He tried to refuse, of course. "Uncle George, I really can't. I have 3 viewings this afternoon, huge deals." I fixed him with a quiet, unwavering gaze. "Kevin, this is about the future of the family's legacy. It won't take long, but you, as a close relative and my realtor nephew, need to be on this call." The use of the word legacy hooked him. He instantly assumed I was about to announce the sale of the clock, likely confirming him as the exclusive agent, justifying his earlier actions in his own greedy mind. His desire for profit finally outweighed his panic. He nodded stiffly and sat down, never letting his hands leave the relative safety of his pockets. I told Sarah that I needed her help to set up the group video call on my laptop. I played up the technical ineptitude of the 70-year-old. This was my next key move. I specifically used a platform like Zoom or FaceTime that would easily accommodate dozens of family members. Sarah quickly started sending the group invitation to all our immediate and extended relatives, including the cousins, aunts, and uncles, who Kevin relied on for professional referrals. As the family members started joining the call, their faces filling the screen one by one, the anticipation in the room became thick enough to cut with a knife. Kevin sat stiffly beside me, his back perfectly straight, his face a mask of false piety. He kept tapping his foot, a small nervous tic that betrayed his composure. Everyone was asking, "What's the big news, George? Are you finally moving to Florida? Or, did you win the lottery?" He loved being the center of attention, but this time he was trapped. He was forced to listen, to witness, and soon to be exposed in front of every single person whose respect and business he craved. "Just waiting for Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan," I announced calmly, stalling for effect, letting the audience build. I glanced over at Kevin. He was sweating slightly again, and I saw his right hand flexing inside his pocket, likely attempting to scrub the last remnants of the invisible dye. Poor guy. He had no idea that the harder he rubbed, the deeper the non-toxic chemical stain was setting into the ridges of his skin. The silence stretched, the video call buffering with anticipation. I smiled inwardly. This wasn't a doctor's appointment. This was the final consultation, and the diagnosis was about to be delivered live to the entire family. Indifference silence finally broke when I started speaking. I looked directly into the camera, addressing the entire family, but my words were meant for Kevin, who sat rigid and sweating beside me. Thank you all for joining this urgent call. I called you here today not to talk about money, but about memory and trust. I spoke about the grandfather clock, not as an antique worth 6 figures, but as a monument to Grandpa's unwavering love and his war letters to Grandma. I described how the clock held the essence of our family history, our shared values, our trust, our truth. I watched Kevin out of the corner of my eye. He was barely listening, his face a mask of false piety, clearly just waiting for me to announce the sale so he could claim his undeserved commission. I paused, letting the emotional weight of my words settle over the stunned faces on the video call. You see, I continued, this clock is not just a mechanism. It's a moral compass. And it has a very long memory. I slowly reached into the side pocket of my armchair. I didn't pull out a gun or a contract. I pulled out a small, handheld, ultraviolet UV flashlight, the exact kind I use to check the authenticity of old stamps and porcelain. The family watched, confused, wondering what this strange tool had to do with a family announcement. For the past few months, I said, my voice dropping to a low, powerful register that carried absolute authority. Kevin has been telling Sarah and many of you that I am losing my mind, that I promised him this clock, that I'm forgetful. I turned my head slightly toward Kevin, who was still trying to maintain his professional smirk. Kevin, are you forgetting something? Before he could formulate his denial, I slowly, deliberately angled the UV beam away from the camera and directly onto his hands, which were still jammed deep into his pockets. Kevin's last thread of composure shattered. He gasped, a loud, ragged sound that everyone on the video call clearly heard. The invisible die, which he thought he'd wiped clean, exploded into life under the UV beam. His hands, all the way up past his knuckles and lightly dusting the cuffs of his expensive shirt, were now glowing a brilliant, shocking, electric blue. It was the undeniable proof. On the video call, faces went from confused to horrified, and then utterly condemning. Sarah stifled a cry of shock as she finally understood the clear, oily residue she had noticed earlier. Kevin yanked his hands out of his pockets as if burned, his eyes wide with desperate terror, staring at the visible, shining evidence of his betrayal. I kept the light steady, locking eyes with him. The camera recorded the glowing hands for the entire family to see. Kevin, I stated clearly, letting the cruel public truth sink in. 50 years ago, I knew that anyone who tried to steal those letters would have greed in their heart. The clock didn't want to go into your hands. It remembers who its true owner is, and it marked the thief for all of us to see. Now, I concluded, turning off the light and plunging his hands back into temporary, normal darkness. We all see who you are. And now, if you'll excuse me, I must go wash that non-toxic ink off the clock's casing. It's time for you to leave. Silence after I turned off the UV light was more deafening than the whistle inside the clock. On the video call, confusion instantly turned into shock, and then quickly into a cacophony of furious voices, all directed at one person, Kevin. My sister-in-law, his own mother, was openly crying in shame on the screen. Cousins, who had relied on Kevin for professional real estate referrals, were visibly disgusted. He didn't wait for the inevitable wave of formal condemnation. Kevin mumbled a broken, pathetic attempt at an excuse, something vague about a misunderstanding and cleaning fluids, but his voice cracked with fear and humiliation. He snatched his bag, which now felt less like a briefcase and more like a sack of his own lies, and bolted out the front door without another word. Sarah sat there, watching the door slam shut behind her cousin. She looked heartbroken, but also visibly relieved. The agonizing internal battle between her love for her father and the doubt planted by her cousin was finally over. She turned to me, tears in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear or confusion. "Dad," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "I am so incredibly sorry. I should never, ever have questioned you." She got up and hugged me tight, a fierce, desperate embrace that felt like the tension of the last few months finally draining away. That hug was worth more than the clock, worth more than any engineered revenge. I had not only protected the heirloom, I had protected my relationship with my daughter and restored my dignity. The consequences for Kevin were swift and absolute. His reputation, which was his greatest asset as a realtor, was utterly destroyed by that single video call. The family group chat became a repository of his shame. He lost major contracts overnight, and, unable to face the constant, quiet condemnation of his family, he eventually sold his practice and moved across the country. As for me, I carefully wiped the invisible blue residue off the clock's magnificent casing, and then I kept working. I started a new, ambitious restoration project on a complex 17th-century astrolabe, finding renewed joy and purpose in my mechanisms. I felt lighter, younger, and finally, completely at peace. I didn't just survive the betrayal, I thrived. My engineer's mind, which had waited 50 years for its final moment, had delivered justice better than any courtroom ever could. I look back now and feel confident in my choices. I protected my family's legacy and exposed a dishonest person, all without violence or property damage. But I have to ask you, the listener, did I do the right thing by humiliating him publicly in front of the whole family? Or should I have handled it quietly, just between family? What would you have done in my place? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of a 50-year-old plan for clever revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss another unbelievable true story. Thank you for listening.